So what about expenditures? We've got an idea of the different types of taxes that can be levied on people. What about expenditures? So expenditures, as we can see, have grown over time, and here we have a really good example of how expenditures increased substantially. And this is obviously the World War II period of time, World War I down here, and expenditures continue to grow. We have some countries that have high levels of expenditures like that of Sweden, with high social spending in certain economies, and some economies here, for example, United States, where expenditures, for example, on certain items are a little bit lower. France is between the two, and this is often reflected in the social spending categories. In France, if you want to have an idea of where we are in the economy, in 2018 we had a deficit of about 76 billion euros, and that has risen to about 92 billion euros in 2019. So government spending trends upwards, and government spending is going to reflect obviously certain important areas and important events in an economy. It also reflects the attitude towards certain types of expenditures. Do we spend money on education? Do we spend money on healthcare? These are choices. These are choices an economy has to make. So expenditures can take many different forms. We have different types of expenditures at the federal level, the national level of a government. We can also have expenditures, obviously, at local levels, and I'll say a few words about that in a second. Typical types of expenditures for national governments are for education, for defense spending, for Social Security and social programs, and interest payments, because governments have borrowed a lot of money over the years, and we have to pay the interest on what we've borrowed. And we'll see in a minute that's becoming quite large. If we look at total federal spending in the United States, we have an amount that's been trending upwards over the last few years, very slightly, and this is as a percentage of GDP. We see that defense spending has gone down. It was quite low. There was a slight increase in the 1980s. It went down, and then we went into certain wars over this period, so it went back up. The interest here has been tracking. It went up and now has gone down a little bit over time. Social Security is rising. This is to reflect also the fact that the population is getting older with time, and healthcare is actually trending upwards for the U.S. Economy. If we look at France, if we divide up our budget by basically the different ministries that exist or branches of government, one of the most important expenditures in the French economy is education. And unlike in the United States, education is also financed at the university level in the French economy, which is not the case in the United States. And so education expenses are not as big. Military is also a big item. Also in France, if we take a look at the interest payments, these are the interest payments that the government must pay. And we can see that's a substantial amount of money, about 35 billion in interest payments that have to be paid. Okay, let's move on. Local governments also have budgets, and they also play an important role in expenditures by the state. Here we can see the local government expenditures, and I've gathered this data for 2015 to give you an idea. The government in France has a national government. We also have regional, department, and city-based governments. The operating expenses, for example, of these different departments are here. They collect taxes locally. They also make investments in roads, for example. What we do find in a lot of economies is that local taxes typically will pay for local services. Taxes made locally typically in countries like France include property taxes, residency taxes, and even sometimes TV taxes or things like that. These are typically associated with specific parts of the country. Property taxes and residency taxes will depend upon where you live. and the services that are provided locally. And by having the tax done locally and expenditures done locally, we can minimize some of the expenses and cost of managing tax collection and distribution of funds. Let's take a few minutes to talk about debt and deficit. So here you've got the amount of debt of the USA and France, and this is the percent of GDP that the debt represents over time. And we can see that the debt of the United States has exceeded 100% of annual GDP, and it's close to that for France today. We're just hovering right near 100%. So that means that the production, the value of total production produced in a given year is about equal to all the debt and what we owe. So again, remember, what is debt? Debt is not deficit. Deficit is the difference between annual income and annual expenditures. Debt is the accumulation of what we've borrowed, what we owe to pay for these deficits. So imagine the first year you're operating a business and you have a deficit. Your income is less than your expenditures, so you have to borrow that money. The same thing the next year, you borrow a little bit more, and this accumulation of money you've borrowed is what we call the debt. It's what you owe to have run all these deficits over the period of time. Now, being part of Europe, we have certain restrictions on how big our deficit can be and how big our debt can be as a percentage of GDP. And these are ways to align the economies to make fiscal and monetary policies more effective. So if we can all somehow respect these limits, it would be good. And so we've got this treaty on stability that EU member states must try to respect. The size of the deficit, about 0.5% of GDP, and budget size of the deficit would be here. The limits would be the budget deficit of no more than 3% of GDP, and debts above 60% of GDP should try to be avoided. So, where are we? Well, France is currently running about, and like I told you before, we're very close to 100% of our debt as a percentage of GDP. So we've easily exceeded that 60%. Now, those aren't strict limits. We've also very close to the 3% limit on the deficit. And so we see here that deficit in 2019 was a negative 3% of GDP. It's expected to be a little bit less in 2020, but based on recent events in terms of the coronavirus, we can expect that this number will be much bigger. However, European Union countries probably will not be subject to any penalties due to the existence of the coronavirus. What changes can impact the deficit? Obviously, the baby boom. We have all of our baby boomers hitting retirement age. We can expect that we're going to have a lot more healthcare expenditures, and obviously these people, retirement people, are probably paying less taxes. So we're going to probably see the deficit increase. Recessions often see high deficits. Governments will try to relaunch the economy. We'll see that in a minute, by spending money. Also during recessions, incomes are down, and so income tax is smaller. During expansionary periods, though, what do we have? We typically have higher revenues, and if people are making more money, well, then we're collecting a little bit more tax. During a wartime, well, it's pretty obvious we're going to be having an increase in government expenditures, and we can expect that deficits will rise. Health crises, well, we're going through one right now, and we can see that the deficit will probably also increase.